These are some of the worst people to take advantage of lonely hearts. Let's get started with number 5, notamatch.com. Scam artist John Martin Hill swindled over $80,000 from Lisa Goodgames, a widowed woman he met on Match.com. Hill matched with Goodgames online, where he lied about his wealth and intentions. Hill told Goodgames he was in love with her and that he would buy her a house. The guy was a real pickup artist. The relationship between Hill and Goodgames moved very quickly. Within a week of meeting, they decided they wanted to get married and live together. Once Hill had Goodgames' trust, he began to exploit it. Hill convinced Goodgames to buy them a house and furniture. He requested she give him some money toward the purchases to prove she was serious about their relationship. Like your great-great-grandparents did when they got married, except it was goats. Goodgames sent him a certified check of $75,000 for the house and furniture and an additional $8,500 in cash. Once the check cleared, he went on a spending spree in Atlanta, where he bought clothes, food, and a BMW sedan. The purchase of the house failed because Hill couldn't provide proof that he would be able to pay for it. Mainly because before he deposited Goodgames' check in his account, Hill had a balance of $9.84. With the sale falling through, Hill suddenly distanced himself from Goodgames, making excuses for not being able to provide proof of funds. She demanded her money back, and Hill responded by blocking her number. It was then that Goodgames realized Hill had given her a fake address, claiming he lived in the Atlanta suburb of Johns Creek. This guy wasn't who he said he was. Goodgames contacted the police and reported that Hill had tricked her into giving him thousands of dollars. She explained that he pretended to be interested in her and made false claims about his wealth and intentions. Goodgames also provided police with financial records, a copy of the check she wrote, and screenshots of their conversations. Despite all the evidence, Hill still claimed he never went shopping for houses with Goodgames and that the money she gave him was for a business transaction rather than buying a home. Technically, he was right, as he made quite a few transactions. Investigators discovered Hill had arrest warrants in multiple states, including Delaware, Maryland, New Jersey, and Virginia. He was also facing similar charges for fraud in Fulton County. Hill had run quite a series of other scams. In one, he used Craigslist, Instagram, and other social media sites to pose as the CEO of a company that recruited high school athletes, promising to help them earn varsity scholarships. Hill also advertised employment at his fake company and interviewed women that responded to his posting. Once he had their information, he would ask them for cash for background checks, insurance, work permits, or a cell phone. He would give them a proposed employment start date, but then stop contacting them. Following his arrests, Hill would post bail, skip town, and change his name, thus avoiding lengthy prison stints. But Hill couldn't run forever. He appeared before the Gwinnett County Court, where he was convicted for his fraudulent activities and sentenced to 7 years in prison. Additionally, the court ordered him to pay $83,500 in restitution and imposed several restrictions on Hill, including prohibiting contact with Goodgames and forbidding him from using any online dating site. John Hill ultimately ended up in a new house, the big house. Number 4, a lonely vacation. Jordan Alexander, a 54-year-old single mom from New Zealand, lost $100,650 to a man she met on a dating website. The scammer called himself James and presented himself as a millionaire businessman, widowed father raising his teenage son while working as a railway consultant. He was basically a Hallmark Christmas movie. James's devotion to his family was one of the things that attracted Alexander to him. He also showered her with attention and impressed her with his successful job. Him claiming to be a millionaire also probably helped. Alexander also noticed James had a strange accent, which seemed to be a mixture of Spanish and South African, and here and there he'd use odd words. The strange accent didn't deter her, though. She found it attractive. Not long into their relationship, James requested a loan of $10,065 for work supplies, which he quickly repaid. Shortly after, he asked Alexander for another loan, this time for $26,942, which he also paid back within a few days. The prompt repayments made it easy for Alexander to trust trust him with future loans. James granted Alexander access to his bank accounts to prove his financial status. She saw he had millions in his account with a roughly $15 million balance, making his story about being a wealthy businessman entirely plausible. It seemed that everything was in order. It would be totally shocking if things ended up not being as they seemed. With the pair's relationship becoming more serious, they arranged to meet in person in Hawaii. Before the trip, James asked for money again. This time, his excuse was that he was working in Sri Lanka and couldn't access his accounts due to internet issues. The request was odd, but Alexander sent him the funds, convinced he would return it as he had previously. Alexander traveled to Hawaii, but James never showed up. He had a list of excuses for his absence, including being held in Sri Lanka due to work. James also claimed his son was attending school in the US when a hurricane hit and asked for money to help him. At this point, Alexander realized that her dream man was an internet scammer. Alexander lent James $100,657, which she never got back. She had to take out loans against her house to have enough money to send James. Alexander's debts mounted, and her only option was to sell her family home. She eventually decided to write a book, sharing her story about the scam and its impact on her life. Alexander hoped to use it as an outlet to raise awareness for the tactics scammers employ, dispel the shame associated with falling for online scammers, and create a supportive environment for people in similar situations. If you can't trust widowed millionaire businessmen who are also devoted fathers that you meet online, who can you trust? Number 3. Already taken. Diane Peebles, a 61-year-old woman from Scotland, spent over $121,000 on her Sri Lankan husband, but learned he was already married to someone else. Peebles met Priyanjana de Zoysa while on vacation in Sri Lanka when she was 53 and he was 20. The couple got married despite their 33-year age gap. They probably had so much in common, how could they not get married? However, de Zoysa was living a double life and was already married to an 18-year-old local girl. Peebles used her life savings to buy her and her new husband a home in Sri Lanka. She put the property in her husband's name as it was supposedly difficult for a foreigner to own a home in the country. Peebles also spent $38,000 on a Toyota Hiace minivan for de Zoysa to use as a taxi, bought furniture and gifts for his family, and covered the costs of their food and fuel while living next door to them. De Zoysa caught Peebles' attention while she was on vacation. He was working at a hotel and as a tuk-tuk driver and asked Peebles for her cell phone number and address. They began communicating via text, and Peebles enjoyed de Zoysa's attention. After a few months of talking, Peebles returned to Sri Lanka to see de Zoysa. They went to the registrar's office where Peebles thought they had to log their intent to marry, but de Zoysa unexpectedly urged her to proceed with the wedding that day. At first, de Zoysa was a loving and attentive husband. Peebles sold her apartment in Scotland for $128,000 and retired from her customer service assistant job so they could start their new life. It was still earlier in their relationship when de Zoysa and his family seemed to rely on Peebles to support them financially. She funded the building of a new 3-bedroom home, bought a fridge, freezer, and a water purifier for the family. The money Peebles made from selling her apartment didn't last long, which meant she had to live off her $444 a month pension. But it was worth it, right? They were married. How could this backfire? On Valentine's Day in 2016, Peebles found a card addressed to de Zoysa that said, "To my husband." Peebles confronted him about it, and de Zoysa claimed it was a prank. But she discovered the card was from his other wife, whom Peebles met when the local girl visited for tea. Peebles was grappling with the realization she was being exploited when in 2017, thugs shot and killed de Zoysa. She believed that, in response to the money she had given him, the thugs became jealous and started extorting him for cash too. Everything Peebles paid for, such as the house and de Zoysa's vehicle, was in de Zoysa's name. His passing left her stranded in Sri Lanka while she struggled to reclaim her assets. Eventually, Peebles returned to Scotland with the help of some friends she made online, including a retired police chief. Since the traumatic ordeal, Peebles has attempted to rebuild her life and has warned other women against getting into similar situations. Number 2. Losing everything. Donald Griffith thought he met the love of his life online. Instead, he lost his entire life savings in an online romance scam. Griffith thought he'd fallen in love with a woman named Mary, who was working abroad and needed financial help. Mary was a ring of Nigerian scammers, and over the course of 3 to 4 years, Griffith sent increments of money up to $40,000 at once to whom he thought was his dream woman. Griffiths was lonely and and when Mary entered his life, he thought they shared a genuine connection. She used his interests and background to build trust and make him believe they had a real relationship. The scammers not only convinced him to send them money, but they also made him think his family members were only after his money. This made Griffith weary and skeptical of his family's intentions and further isolated him from people that could have caught the scam. Griffith sent a total of $750,000 to the scammers throughout his fraudulent relationship. Even though they were romantically involved for years, Griffith never spoke to Mary on the phone. Avoiding talking on the phone is a common tactic scammers use to prevent shattering the illusion and not to arouse suspicion. An FBI investigation into the Nigerian scammers uncovered that they were scamming a significant amount of money out of multiple victims at the same time. They targeted elderly victims and stole upwards of $22 million. Griffith passed away in a dire financial state. After losing his life savings, his health deteriorated and he didn't have the financial resources to care for himself, struggling with basic necessities like eating healthily. The FBI indicted 10 people involved in the crime ring, 9 of whom were either found guilty at trial or through a plea bargain, while at least 1 remained at large in Nigeria. Elderly fraud is on the rise in the US, with scammers preying upon people who are lonely and seeking attention and using various avenues on the internet to target the country's elderly population. According to the FBI, seniors lost $1.7 billion in scams in 2022, partially caused by an increased online presence where they communicate with relatives, online shop, and even search for love. Before we get to the last story, if you're enjoying this video, be sure to stay tuned for our past release to hear about how this lady flipped things around and got her romance scammer back. Number 1. The Secret Mission. Laura Francis, a 69-year-old California resident, fell victim to a scammer who claimed to be a military surgeon on a secret mission in North Korea. The scammer went by the name David Hodge and met Francis on Facebook. He sent Francis love notes, himself singing love songs, and shared information about his past relationships. Hodge told Francis he was a surgeon on secret missions for the Marines and was in North Korea helping injured soldiers at the time. Hodge's stories drew Francis to him, and she fell for him hard. Francis wanted to look as beautiful as possible when she met Hodge for the first time, and spent $10,000 on cool sculpting so she would be at her best. It wasn't long before Hodge asked Francis for money, saying he couldn't access his accounts. He told her to send him money through Bitcoin apps, Coinbase, and CoinCloud Bitcoin ATMs. Francis sent him large sums of money, dipping into part of her daughter's inheritance. As their relationship progressed, Francis grew suspicious of Hodge's intentions. Hodge reassured her by sending her a bank statement from an Ohio bank stating he had a $3 million balance. The statement had a Chase Bank P.O. box, which was likely fabricated. Hodge told Francis he could buy an engagement ring through a military program, but he needed her to send him $42,568 to cover the cost of the ring. She eagerly waited for it to arrive, but the package never arrived. Instead, she received a cheap zirconia ring with a $9.99 price tag on it. Francis confronted Hodge about the ring, which he said must have been a mistake and that he would sort it out. Francis's daughter was suspicious of Hodge and convinced her to join Plenty of Fish. Francis met another man, Robert Manguire, who claimed he was an oil rig executive. She told him about her relationship with Hodge, and Manguire said he could hack computers and get to the bottom of all of this. Manguire discovered David Hodge was a Nigerian scammer named Dom. Manguire informed Francis that he had contacted the military, where Hodge said he was stationed, to tell them that Hodge was sharing inside information. Francis turned her attention from Hodge to Manguire and quickly developed feelings for him. Manguire then convinced Francis that David Hodge had been arrested for espionage and being a spy. This, of course, spun Francis out. She didn't just turn off the feelings lights right away. Instead, she sent $60,000 to bail Hodge out. Francis had no clue she was falling further victim to the scam. Eventually, Francis realized that David Hodge and Robert Manguire worked together to deceive her. Manguire pretended to expose Hodge to encourage Francis to pay more money into blockchain accounts to recover her original funds. She later made the devastating discovery that the scammers were in on it the entire time. Francis worked with a group called Social Catfish to get her money back. The group traced the accounts to Nigeria and collaborated with the government to recover the lost funds. Hopefully, Francis's daughter takes a more active role in making sure her poor mom doesn't get scammed again. You never do anything spontaneous. Those were the words spoken to the then 36-year-old Acacia Windnot by her friend before she went on a date with Wilson Jackson. The man who would consume the next few years of her life for all the wrong reasons. Wiedenot's life truly changed when she received a friend request and a follow-up Facebook message from Jackson. On the surface, Jackson seemed like a genuine guy. He wore nice clothes in his pictures, and they even shared 4 mutual friends. His expression on the photos oozed charm, intelligence, and confidence. Jackson's message was, "What's up, beautiful?" Confirm these impressions. "What's up, beautiful" wasn't an uncommon first message for Wiedenot to find in her DMs. It's a message that she's used to getting. Nevertheless, Jackson stuck out like a well-dressed, confident thumb. To his "What's up, beautiful," Wiedenot responded with a suspicious "hello." But it was enough to get a response from Jackson. He continued the Facebook message convo with Wiedenot for several weeks before asking her on a date. During those weeks, Wiedenot became close to Jackson. She found out he wasn't a catfish after they FaceTimed on a few occasions. They spoke on the phone, talking about their mutual love of sports, particularly football. Jackson asked her about the 9 years she served in the Air Force, and Wiedenot answered, telling him all about her time abroad. Jackson listened to every word. In fact, Wiedenot got the impression that he cared about her, especially when he offered to fly Wiedenot from her home in Scottsdale, Arizona, out to his house in LA for Christmas. Wiedenot's original plans were to spend Christmas with her best friend, but the plans were canceled at the last minute. Now, left with no holiday plans, Wiedenot was still on the fence about accepting Jackson's offer. This was not something she'd normally do. Wiedenot's friend eventually convinced her to let Jackson buy her a ticket to LA and finally do something spontaneous. Wiedenot packed her things and left for the airport. Earlier, Jackson sent Wiedenot a screenshot of the boarding pass he'd bought for her. Everything seemed to be in order. Not to mention, Wiedenot had finally found someone she liked who could meet her expectations. However, when she got to the airport, employees said her ticket was invalid. Wiedenot, assuming something must have gone wrong during the purchasing process, called Jackson to get things sorted out. But when Jackson answered the phone, he didn't offer a solution. Instead, he insisted the ticket must be valid. Wiedenot explained that the flight would leave soon and she needed a ticket to LA pronto. So Jackson instructed Wiedenot to buy a ticket at the airport. He promised to pay her back when she got to LA, and to prove something was going on with the ticket he initially bought, Jackson sent Wiedenot screenshots of him dealing with the bank. Wiedenot says she proceeded to buy a ticket to LA and boarded the plane. Her plane landed at LAX in the late hours of the night. Jackson picked her up and took her to the movies. Wiedenot recalls how he was in person just as charming, fun, and kind as he seemed on FaceTime. Jackson asked her about Wiedenot's future, her career aspirations, and any wild, crazy dreams she harbored. In the morning, like a true gentleman, he cooked her breakfast, a classic combination of bacon and eggs. After they ate breakfast, Jackson took Wiedenot back to the airport. On Monday, her second full day back home, Wiedenot noticed over $3,000 was missing from her bank account. Wiedenot scanned her card's transaction history and discovered where the purchases were made. The largest transaction was a $2,500 transfer to another account. The other 2 payments for a plane ticket and items at a fast food restaurant. All the money charges were billed from California. Wiedenot knew exactly who had used her card. So, not long after seeing the charges, Wiedenot filed a police report against Jackson. She wanted Jackson apprehended as soon as possible. Unfortunately, the police didn't share her desire for revenge. When Wiedenot called the Scottsdale police, they deferred her to the Los Angeles police, who boomeranged Wiedenot right back to Scottsdale police, telling her she'd have to file her report with them. Most people would give up, as $3,000 might not be a big deal. But Wiedenot didn't care about the money. Instead of moving on, Wiedenot started her own investigation into Jackson. Jackson had already blocked her number, so asking her suspect questions over the phone was not an option. With no prior background in research, Wiedenot began investigating Jackson. She started with the basics. Where did Jackson live? Even though she'd been to his house, Wiedenot couldn't remember Jackson's address, and without his address, finding Jackson would be very difficult. She couldn't find any home addresses linked to the purchases on her bank statement, but she did find the address of the fast food restaurant. After finding the restaurant address, Wiedenot searched every apartment complex in the area, and with the help of her memory, found the apartment complex she stayed at with Jackson. She remembered Jackson taking her to a tall building, so tall that they had to park in an underground parking garage. So, Wiedenot narrowed her search to tall apartment buildings with underground garages. She also remembered being close to a movie theater on a noisy LA street. Using these very specific criteria, Wiedenot found a potential match. Just to be sure it was the building she stayed at, the rookie sleuth looked up the floor plans, then based on her memory of walking through the rooms and hallways, determined this was the place. Wiedenot called the building's phone number and asked the clerk if a resident named Will Jackson lived there. The clerk said no, and Wiedenot felt a dreadful epiphany wash over her. Will Jackson was not his real name. Wiedenot kept digging. She used methods she initially learned from MTV's Catfish, such as reverse Google image searches on Jackson's Facebook page. Eventually, one of those reverse searches yielded a link to a social media account under a different name. The account had an email written in the bio. Wiedenot dug deeper into the email account and discovered it belonged to someone named Sincere Jackson. Wiedenot kept digging and Googled the name. The results were mostly unrelated, except for one article. The article was small, only 85 words, but it contained some vital info on Jackson. Oddly enough, the article's publisher was from Orlando, a local paper called the West Orlando News. In 2011, the Orlando News published an article on Jackson, saying that the police department were searching for victims willing to come forward and testify against Jackson. Alongside the victim's story was a mugshot of Jackson, who Wiedenot easily recognized. The real question was, who are these victims? And what did Jackson do to them? Was it similar to what he did to her? Detective Wiedenot would soon find out. In 2007, a Florida woman who gave reporters the alias Shonda Porter dated Jackson. She described him as a snake who could shed his skin on command and become anyone he needed to be. But that isn't how Jackson saw himself. Porter dated Jackson long enough to notice a large tattoo on his back, written in bold, daring letters, "Outlaw." Wiedenot would later discover, after some more online sleuthing, that Jackson grew up as anything but an outlaw. According to public records, Jackson was born in Daytona Beach, Florida. Contrary to his tattoo, Jackson was raised in a conservative Christian household. Growing up, he did everything he could to escape his family's culture. As a young man, Jackson attempted to start a rap career under the name Da Truth. However, Da Truth wasn't very good. Jackson spent his early years bouncing around Florida, mainly between Tallahassee and Orlando, all the while claiming to his many girlfriends he was playing football and writing bars. In reality, Jackson was learning how to scam people, specifically successful young women on social media and dating apps. These girls saw Jackson the same way Wiedenot had. Handsome, well-dressed, tall, fit-looking man with charm to impress even the most skeptical women. He used these attributes to lure dozens of women into trusting him. After contacting other victims and hearing their stories, Wiedenot discovered Jackson's operation. She also realized how similar her story was to other victims. On a basic level, all the other victims, including Wiedenot, had a few common experiences. They were contacted by Jackson, usually online, talked with him for a while, then he asked them for a favor or some kind of big purchase with the promise of reimbursement, after which Jackson would either not pay them back or steal their bank information and disappear, seemingly without a trace, until he met Wiedenot, of course. She was the only victim who cared enough to track him down. In fact, no one did more than her in finding so-called Will Jackson, whose birth name was Wilson Edward Jackson. However, he used the name Sincere often, which is why Wiedenot had such a tough time finding him. But when she did, Wiedenot finally saw how extensive Jackson's scamming truly was. Before she continued her research on the other victims, Wiedenot contacted a professional, then 55-year-old LAPD detective Stephanie Kratchier. By 2018, when Wiedenot reached out to her, Detective Kratchier had been investigating Jackson for a while, ever since the charming scam artist had moved to LA back in 2014. Wiedenot could not arrest Jackson herself, but Kratchier could. The Scottsdale sleuth presented Kratchier with all the evidence she collected so far and convinced the LA detective that Jackson needed to be arrested immediately. Kratchier, however, had a lot on her plate. The city of Angels was filled with scamming demons, and small-scale scams like Jackson's were not a number one priority. Nevertheless, the overworked and overwhelmed detective promised Wiedenot she would arrest Jackson as soon as possible. Wiedenot hung up the phone feeling confident that Kratchier would take care of the arrest. In the meantime, however, Wiedenot could not let the case go. So far, Kratchier only had 8 victims who'd reported Jackson to the authorities. Wiedenot was determined to find more. Wiedenot got to work quickly. She started using the very app Jackson used to contact her to look for other victims in Florida and California. The posts worked, and Wiedenot started talking to several other victims from the 2 states. She even put them in touch with one another, creating a network of Jackson victims who could talk about their experiences. Kratchier found 8 victims during years of investigation. Wiedenot found 10 victims in just 1 month. These women, mostly African American in their 30s, told each other how Jackson humiliated them. Though many of the victims shared their stories with other victims, most were reluctant to give their names to the media out of embarrassment. They all wanted to see some form of justice, though. Crashier promised Wiedenot an arrest, with the deadline being April 2018. But after traveling to Afghanistan for a few months to work as a civilian air traffic controller, Wiedenot looked at the calendar and noticed the month was January, the year 2019. Wiedenot, in her extensive research, remembered reading how Jackson had gotten away. Most of the escapes were made possible by lazy investigators and prosecutors. Wiedenot couldn't let another detective leave him under a pile of other cases. So she gave Crashier an ultimatum: arrest Jackson, or Wiedenot would file a complaint on the veteran detective who was set to retire any day now. Crashier chose the harder option and looked up Jackson on her computer. She found a warrant in his name for Grand Theft Auto and sent a team of officers to bring him in. Jackson was arrested on May 23, 2019 in Los Angeles. He was taken into police custody and hired a lawyer, but the lawyer left after Jackson's check bounced. His public defender convinced him to plead not guilty despite over 60 women coming forward to testify against him on 33 felony charges. In total, Jackson is believed to have collected over $200,000 from his victims, including Wiedenot. Sadly, they'll never get that money back. But they can enjoy knowing that Jackson's face and reputation were smeared across news media outlets like Newsweek, The Daily Beast, and several local LA outlets. Click to watch one of these next videos. Let us know in the comment section which type of scam is easier to fall for, a romance scam or a get-rich-quick type business scam.